So we are in 1 Peter once again today. For those of you who haven't been here in the last few weeks, I'm new, and so if you're new, I may be beginning to realize that I haven't seen you before. And there are some faces that are unfamiliar to me a little bit this morning, so welcome again. But we have been in a series for a couple of weeks where we're talking about virtues. And virtues are something that they're not born in us necessarily, but they are actions and ways of living that we can cultivate, that we can practice, that we can work on, that we can make better in our lives in terms of how we live in public and in private, the ways we behave. So this morning we're going to continue that talk, and especially we're going to talk about this virtue of compassion. Now, these are unexpected virtues that we've been talking about because they're not the big ones. There are some big virtues that the biblical authors write about. There are some big virtues that philosophers have written about over the years. But today is probably the closest we're coming to one of the big ones, and that is the virtue of compassion. I wanted to think about that this morning, just because I think it is a virtue that perhaps is lost a little bit in today's society. And so in 1 Peter 3, is you see the verse that we just had read for us in a different translation. It says, "Finally, all of you should be of one mind, sympathize with each other, love each other as brothers and sisters, be tenderhearted, and keep a humble attitude." Now, this New Living Translation version does not use the word compassion, but the idea is there as well. And so the idea of being tenderhearted and keeping a humble attitude in particular is going to be something that we're focused on this morning. But the reality is that all of this is a piece of the puzzle. And we'll talk about that some. But as I mentioned last week, there's a story behind 1 Peter. And 1 Peter tells of a church, and it's a letter written to a church that is kind of out of place in the world. And the world around them is different from ours from 2,000 years ago, and yet there are some striking similarities, and there's some parallels that we could draw between their life and our life today. And we went into some detail about that last week, so I'm not going to go over all of that again. But the reality is that they lived in a world that seemed to show very little compassion towards these brothers and sisters, these Christians who were living in a world that did not appreciate them. And there would be, I think, a temptation, and a natural temptation, to live a life that reciprocated in kind. A lack of compassion towards others. But Peter is reminding this church in sort of a Roman way, saying here's how the household should exist. And he's gone through and he's talked about husbands and wives and fathers and mothers and so on and so forth. And he's talked about how the whole household in the Roman Empire that it's built on should work, but he's twisting and kind of subverting this social structure until he gets to the end in this verse that says, "Finally, all of you." No one is left out. It doesn't matter if you weren't included in any of the labels that he applied in the chapters before, those fathers, mothers, children, slaves, whatever it might be. It doesn't matter. He says, "Finally, all of you." And he gives them this instruction. And so, how do we live in a world that sometimes seems unwelcoming to my belief? How do we live in a world that sometimes seems like I have to be out of place? And the reality is, I think if we're Christians and we don't feel out of place, we are missing something in what it means to walk a Christian walk. We should be a little different. We should be a little out of place. And over the last year, this is a phrase that I've heard frequently. Maybe you did as well. We're all in this together. And I spent some time, part-time, working at a giant grocery store over in York County before we came up here. And this was one of those phrases that was on the recording that played over and over and over again as music would go through, and every once in a while an announcement would be made, and then they would say, "We're all in this together." And I heard it other places as well. It wasn't just at the giant coming over the PA system, but there was a part of me laboring there as I was lifting sides of beef in the meat department that said, "Yeah, whoever made that recording, you are not in this together with me. Get down here on the front line, put on a mask, and start unloading some trucks, right? Let's get some toilet paper on the shelves," because it was missing. And the reality was that it didn't feel like we were all in this together. As employees who were on the front line, we would have customers come in who just didn't care, right? And they, I get the mask thing, but we had this one pair of customers, I believe they were husband and wife, who came in and said, "I don't wear a mask because I think for myself," on their shirts. That was their, and they made it clear, "I don't wear a mask because I think for myself." And I started to think about that shirt. And whatever your opinion, your belief on masks is, let's just analyze that for a second, because I think for myself, and I decided to wear a mask. Right? So basically their shirt was a demand. I think for myself, so I don't wear a mask. Therefore, if you truly think for yourself was the insinuation, you wouldn't choose to wear a mask either. Well, that was insulting. Really. And whether they chose to wear a mask was not my point here. The point was, why proclaim it that way if not to stick it to somebody else? Right? That's not compassionate. That's not caring. I know nothing about these people, but it gave me an immediate impression about them and how they might feel about someone who disagreed with them. It made me kind of think, I wouldn't want to have them over for lunch. Right? That's the initial impression that I got. We're all in this together. Well, many times our actions kind of deny the truth of that statement. We weren't all in this together. Over the last year, things have been hard, and it's been hard to get your toilet paper for a while. It was hard to get all those things that were empty off shelves, and it just seems like one thing came after another, from murder hornets to COVID to ships stuck in the Suez Canal, and we couldn't get our supplies at Kohl's. All right, like all that stuff just kind of all hit in 1 year, and we were all in it together, and yet we didn't approach it the same. And in the course of this year, many have developed, the term is compassion fatigue. I'm tired of wearing this mask for others. I've been vaccinated. I'm tired of wearing this mask for others because I'm healthy and I want to go about my life. I'm tired and I'm tired and I'm tired of not going out or staying at home or places being closed. Whatever it might be, we are tired. And I think fatigue and exhaustion are a natural consequence of 2020 and into 2021. But compassion fatigue, now that's something different. I don't know that we should ever get fatigued of showing compassion. So how do we prevent that? How do we go about preventing compassion fatigue so that we can say we're all in this together? One of my favorite theologian authors and ethicists is this guy named Miroslav Volf. And he has written a ton on forgiveness. I think he's one of the best thinkers about forgiveness, and he writes about the whole spectrum of that, but especially when it comes to subjects where you've been like in an abusive relationship. How does an abused person forgive their abuser? And when is that appropriate? How does that work? He has some really interesting thoughts on that, but I want to share with you his thoughts this morning on compassion. And the virtue of compassion comes from this book, Public Faith in Action. And it's how to engage with commitment, conviction, and courage. But he writes about this virtue as something that we practice in our lives for the world to see. And the compassion is, and you can tell here that it's almost at the end of the book. And in fact, footnotes start here. So this is the end of the book. This is how he concludes this book with a call to Christians to have compassion in their lives and in the world. And so he writes this as he defines the virtue. He says, some people think of compassion as simply feeling others' pain. Compassion does involve feeling, but as an emotion and a virtue, it is more than a feeling. Theologians and philosophers have identified three aspects of virtuous compassion: feeling, thinking, and doing. The feeling aspect of compassion is love for the needy and suffering, leading you to experience their pain as painful to you. It's not exactly feeling other people's pain as yours. Rather, their pain prompts your own pain in response. Because you love them, their suffering matters to you and influences your feelings. The feeling aspect of compassion is inscribed right into the world itself. The Latin compassio means roughly suffering or feeling. As strange as it might seem, compassion also involves thinking. Like all emotions and unlike mere feelings, compassion has certain beliefs or judgments built into it. For instance, it only makes sense for Jesus to have compassion for the widow of Nain if he knows something about the relationship between mothers and sons, and understands that she is suffering greatly from the loss of her son. Finally, and crucially, the virtue of compassion involves doing what you can to address suffering. It's striking to read the gospel passages that talk about compassion. Every time the text says that Jesus has compassion on someone, it moves on immediately to his active care for the person or people in question. He cures the sick in Matthew 14 and Mark 1. He multiplies loaves and fishes, Matthew 15 and Mark 8. He touches the blind man's eyes and he sees, in Matthew 20. He says to a dead man, rise, and he rises in Luke 7. He commands his disciples to pray for more laborers to come and help in the harvest. And then he sends these disciples out to heal and deliver and proclaim the kingdom in Matthew 9. As Augustine put it, compassion is a kind of fellow feeling in our hearts for another's misery, which compels us to come to his help by every means in our power. With true compassion, the question is not whether we'll take action, but what means are in our power and what actions are the wisest and most helpful. Now, that leaves us with some questions, and before I answer the big question, which is how? How do I live a life of compassion? And that's a question that we're asking over and over again on Thursday mornings when we gather and study. How do I do this? We read the proverb, how do I do this? And we're going to ask that a lot. How do I live this way? But before I get there, how do we improve our capacity to have this fellow feeling as Augustine? So that we are moved to come to someone else's aid. Before we talk about that, I want to talk about some dangers, some flaws, some problems with compassion in that Mr. Wolf has written about. And compassion can malfunction, and there's 4 ways he identifies it. One of those is that we limit compassion only to immediate circles around ourselves. I take care of me and mine. Right? Compassion is bigger than that. If compassion was only limited to the people that I know, the people that I interact with on a daily basis, the clerk at the grocery store, the guy who cuts my hair, whatever that might be, my neighbors, if that's all the extent of which my compassion can grow to, then I'm missing out on living the way Jesus lived. Let's think about that for a second, because there's this Roman officer back in Luke chapter 7. He was Roman. That's a strike against him. He was in the Roman military. That's another strike against him. And he didn't know Jesus. Jesus didn't know him. And his sick kid wasn't even there. He wasn't in front of Jesus. If we limited compassion only to those in front of us and those we knew and those we approved of in whatever way, those who did good for us or were in that circle, man, I'm glad Jesus wasn't that way. I'm glad Jesus wasn't that way. Another way that we limit compassion is that we set a too low or too high threshold on suffering, which motivates compassion. When someone suffers, we should be motivated to have compassion. And having compassion is that thinking, feeling, and doing. It's all 3 of those aspects, especially the doing. If I stub my toe, I don't need 80 people to bring me an ice pack. Right? The reality is that stubbing my toe, I'm probably not even getting myself an ice pack. But I've done it before, and it hurts. And it hurts like crazy. And you start to wonder, why am I not wearing house slippers or something around the house when that happens? So I can take it up. I don't need compassion in that instance. If we set too low a bar and I stub my toe and I demand you treat me with this sort of compassion, it trivializes it. Right? So that's the easy one for us all to accept, that we can set the bar too low for compassion. And some people, it feels to many of us that their bar for compassion, their need for compassion, the bar is so low that we feel like they have trivialized, and maybe that's part of our compassion. But there's the converse to this, which is that we set the bar too high. And the reality is that this is just an excuse, isn't it? Your suffering is not great enough for me to do something that will alleviate it. Well, that's too high. People need our compassion. People deserve compassion. And when we are suffering, we want compassion ourselves. I think naturally so. And God has built into us both the need to receive compassion and the ability to give it, to alleviate the pains of others. Let's not set the bar too high. Let's not make excuses for not being compassionate towards others. And this is related to the third reason that it can malfunction, which is that we fail to have compassion for those who suffer even as a result of their own choices and behaviors. This is a tough one for a lot of folks. We live in a world that emphasizes our individuality and our individualism. And when somebody makes a mistake and they have consequences that happen because of that mistake, well, they deserve it, right? I spent a few months working in a homeless shelter before moving up here. We had guys from all walks of life, lots of mental health issues. Something like 85% of the men who came to the men's homeless shelter had a dual diagnosis mental illness. Many of them schizophrenic and depression, or depression and some other diagnosed illness. And many of them struggled with drug addiction. And we had one guy who came in, and he had struggled in the past, but it had been years in the past. Well, he got news one day that his sister had passed away. His sister had died. He didn't tell anyone. Several other things happened that just were like darts thrown at him from every direction. He was being attacked. And he had some guy on the street that he bought something from. And we don't know what it was. But that evening, it was the first time that I had worked past 8 o'clock at the homeless shelter. Of course, it was the first time I worked past 8 o'clock. He took a pill. I didn't know he'd taken the pill. All I know is that I heard some guy shouting from the next room, "Hey, guy at the front desk, we need your help." Because this guy, he was big, he was bigger than me, he was a big dude, had just fallen. He'd gone back to the bathroom, come back to it, he'd just fallen down right at the foot of his bed. And he starts to get back up, and I didn't know he had taken something, and I knew he was on blood pressure medication. I thought he had taken extra because he tried to donate plasma that day. He tried to go and donate plasma, but his blood pressure was too high, and his meds, I thought, this guy just took too much blood pressure medication. And I missed the signs. I missed the signs that he had overdosed. I've been trained. I know how to administer Narcan. And we had it. It was a room, it was right there. I missed it. But we treated him as well as we could. I had the AED ready in case it was a heart issue. I was ready to go with everything except the Narcan. And then paramedics arrived. And the first responders that came did a great job. And we were able to get him situated comfortably. And we needed all of us to move him. And then the ambulance arrived. And finally these paramedics, they determined, yes, we're going to administer the Narcan. They did. And like 7 minutes later, he was up. He walked out to the ambulance under his own power. Now, does that mean he didn't deserve compassion because he went and bought a pill and took it at the OD? Frankly, it would be easy to dismiss that choice. And there were consequences to his choice. He was kicked out of the shelter. He was not allowed to stay in the shelter because so many people in that shelter struggle with substance abuse that if you choose to use, you had to get kicked out. It just was not fair to those who were staying on that path of sobriety. But I got to have a conversation with him the next day. He came back from the hospital, we gave him a urine panel, and he tested negative for everything, but there was one drug that does not show up on that one drug test that we give, and that was fentanyl. And we suspect that's what he took. We got a new test like shortly after that that proved it. But we suspect that's what he took, and yet we told him, you came back from Narcan, and everybody saw it, everybody knows you took something, you're out. But, and the but was a really important statement. You have worked hard, you've been here for 3 weeks, you've been sober to this point, you've passed every screening, you've given me breathalyzer and whatnot, you've done everything that has been asked of you in this program, you have one mistake. Don't throw the rest of your life away. We had compassion towards him. He was told after there was 6 you are welcome back. If we limited compassion only to those who deserve compassion, we would all be in trouble, wouldn't we? If God operated that way, we would all be in trouble. And the biblical story that springs to mind before any others, although there are so many that we could use to talk about this, is the story of the prodigal son. that son made every wrong choice imaginable. He asked for his inheritance early. He went off. He squandered it on all kinds of disgraceful living. He did everything in the party and whatnot that he could do to spend that money to live his life to ruin. But when he returned home, his father had compassion on him. Did he suffer as a result of his own choices? Yes. That doesn't mean he didn't deserve that compassion. Let's extend compassion to those even who are suffering as a result of their own choices. And then finally, we limit compassion when we limit it only to individuals. And this one's a little bit harder, although we get some glimpses of it in Scripture. But for many of us, what do I mean by this? Well, we have a person in front of us suffering, and it's easy to show compassion to them. But what about groups of people? But the Bible instructs us to care for groups like widows and orphans. I mean, that's James. That's true religion. We care for widows and orphans as groups because the nature of their condition is such that they suffer. And in this world, there are those who pick whatever demographic label we want to lump people together with. You can choose and say, because of this condition, you may suffer in a fashion that is greater than my suffering. And it's different from my suffering. Maybe I suffer too, but there are things that I will never suffer from in this world because of who I am. And yet there are groups that suffer differently. And so we should remember that. In fact, we're going to read just one little passage here from Matthew. In Matthew chapter 9, and we alluded to this in the reading from the Miroslav Wolf book. But it says that Jesus traveled through all the towns in Matthew 9, and this is verse 35. Jesus traveled through all the towns and villages of that area, teaching in the synagogues and announcing the good news about the kingdom. And he healed every kind of disease and illness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. He said to his disciples, the harvest is great, but the workers are few. So pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest. Ask him to send more workers into his fields. And so this brief passage tells us that Jesus saw the crowds. And he had compassion on them, and so he did something about it. The healing, the serving, of every kind of disease and illness, it's mentioned before he saw the crowds, but I think they're kind of conflated together really here. I think that's the point, is that seeing the crowds and seeing their suffering, yes, the individuals are healed, but also as a group, they were without shepherds. They didn't have leadership, spiritual leadership. They were separated from God. So what did Jesus do? In seeing that, he had compassion towards them. And seeing that the fields were right, he sent out the disciples, and that's what happens next in chapter 10. He sends out 12. Jesus saw the need, and he did something about it. He raised up these 12 apostles, and he sent them out to serve others. Let's not limit our compassion just to individuals. So now, the question, how? How do I develop compassion in my life? I'm going to tell you, I have one solution. How do I limit myself from getting compassion fatigue? It's the same thing. And this is counterintuitive. This is not going to sound like the right answer for many of you. How do I learn to develop more compassion in my life without getting fatigued from all this compassion that's demanded of me today? And the answer is that you need to develop thinner skin. Think about it for a second. We could develop thick skin. We could have calluses all over our hearts and say, I'm not going to show anyone compassion. There are stories over and over again through the Old Testament. Maybe most striking is the story of Pharaoh during the Exodus, and his heart was hardened. And that phrase, his heart was hardened. And whenever Pharaoh's heart was hardened, he went against the will of God. And I'm going to free you Israelites, but then he changed his mind because his heart was hardened. The calluses that develop over our hearts through the course of time are dangerous. The armor that we put up, the walls that we build around our lives to protect us from people who are suffering so that I don't have to suffer with them, these things are dangerous and they are against the will of God. They're not how Christ would help us live. And this is counterintuitive, but we need to feel more. This is counterintuitive, Because when we think about compassion fatigue, we think, well, I need to build up armor. But instead, I'm telling you, develop thinner skin, because people are not projects. People are not problems to be solved. People are made in the image of God. And when people made in the image of God are suffering, followers of our God should be doing something about it. Jesus was a man of compassion. We see that in the scriptures, in these stories that we alluded to this morning. Jesus was a man of compassion. He was a man of compassion because he followed his Father, a God of compassion, who sent Jesus in the greatest act of compassion of all for us who are sinners. So how can his followers be anything but those who feel and think and do, put into practice this virtue of compassion? Let's develop thinner skin. Let's feel more for others, for people around us. Because finally, all of you should be of one mind in this. All of you should sympathize with each other, love each other as brothers and sisters, be tenderhearted, and keep on gratitude. Let's pray. Father in heaven, I am so grateful for the opportunity to come before you and ask this morning that you would increase in our hearts the capacity to have compassion on others. And this may be a case of be careful what you pray for. Because you may give us every opportunity to learn compassion, but Lord, that's okay. I pray that you would put in our path people who are deserving of compassion, that we would develop this thinner skin, that we would be willing to feel more on behalf of others. Lord, help us to engage our imagination and our thinking when we are confronted with suffering that is not like ours, that we might consider, well, how can I understand this better and be willing to do some work? And when I see suffering and compassion, that I can use my thoughts and my ingenuity and my imagination to say, how can I alleviate that? And Lord, that you would give us the increased strength and capability to do that, and then the courage to actually do something about suffering in front of us. Help us to be feelers and thinkers and doers who put into practice this virtue of compassion. Give us the opportunity to practice it this week, in the coming weeks, and all of our lives ahead. Lord, we are grateful most of all for your compassion, this compassion that sent your Son, Jesus, to die for us. As a God of compassion, you understand this better than we do our need. But we are sinners in need of compassion and mercy and grace and forgiveness. And we thank you, Lord, that you've extended that to us through the body and blood of your Son, Jesus Christ.